how does B'nai Noach fit into the scenario here?
How do B'nai Noach fit into what I'm doing? As it turns out, it's something will definitely register as the strangest thing you will hear me say tonight.
I think it's great.
Jews for Jesus and the similar organizations are responsible in large measure for the massive amount of conversion to Judaism and the B'nai Noach movement. As it turns out, anybody who knows anything knows that the vast majority of people who are converting to Judaism or become B'nai Noach come from the evangelical movement that is premillennial dispensationalist, that is messianic, that is Jews for Jesus. But what happens is, Utsu Eitza V'Sufo, Dabru Dova V'Lo Yokum Ki Umanu Kel. It's a verse from Isaiah chapter 8. And that is, they planned against us a big plot to convert the Jews to Christianity. They gathered in Switzerland and Thailand to try to convert us all. But what happened? It sparked a tremendous interest among all these Christians, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish, and going, okay, we have to go to Jews, you have to learn more about Jews and use Jewish lingo, and Yeshua HaMashiach, and all this stuff. And then they started bringing proofs of Isaiah 53 from rabbinic literature. So they started studying our Talmudic text. And what happened? It sparked a tremendous interest among all these Christians, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish, and going, okay, we have to go to Jews, you have to learn more about Jews and use Jewish lingo, and Yeshua HaMashiach, and all this stuff. And then they started bringing proofs of Isaiah 53 from rabbinic literature. So they started studying our Talmudic text. And what happened?
God a Zionist? Before we can answer the question, is God a Zionist, we first need to define the term Zionist. Well, a Zionist is simply someone who believes that the Jewish people should have a homeland in what is now Israel. That's it. Based on that definition, we can say that yes, for sure, God is a Zionist. How can I be so confident? First, the scriptures make it perfectly clear that the land of Israel was to be the lasting homeland of the Jewish people. And when I say perfectly clear, I mean perfectly clear. God himself promised this, repeating it over and over in scores of different texts, most clearly in Psalm 105. In fact, in this passage alone, this theme is repeated in so many different ways that it's almost redundant. The Lord was making a point. The psalm states, he is ever mindful of his covenant, the promise he gave for 1,000 generations that he made with Abraham, swore to Isaac, and confirmed in a decree for Jacob, for Israel as an eternal covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your allotted heritage. Notice the vocabulary used. This is God's covenant, his eternal covenant, the promise he made, his decree. This was something he swore and confirmed. It is eternal for 1,000 generations. Could he have made himself any more clear? It's true that under the law, the Sinai covenant, God said that he would exile his people from their homeland if they sinned and bring them back only if they repented. But this does not annul his previous promises. As Paul explained, what I'm saying is this: the Torah, the law, which came 430 years later, meaning 430 years after God gave his promise to Abraham, does not cancel the covenant previously confirmed by God so as to make the promise ineffective. For if the inheritance is based on law, it's no longer based on a promise, but God has graciously given it to Abraham by means of a promise. That promise still stands, which means that God is still a Zionist. Second, it's impossible to explain the existence of the Jewish people in their ancient homeland today without divine intervention. No other nation has been expelled from its homeland for a period of many hundreds of years, only to maintain its identity and then return to its original homeland. Every other nation that has been scattered from its homeland for a period of centuries has ceased to exist as a nation, without exception, except for the Jewish people. And note that the Jewish people survived as a nation despite centuries of terrible suffering, being expelled from country after country, being herded together in ghettos, being reduced to second-class citizenship, sometimes even facing annihilation, most recently under the Nazis. Yet the Jewish people live, as celebrated in Hebrew, Am Yisrael Chai, because God has preserved them. As a Jew myself, I can say he has preserved us, not because of our faithfulness, but because of his faithfulness, not because of our goodness, but because of his goodness. And just think, The Nazis slaughtered 6 million Jews, 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe, and yet today there are more than 6 million Jews living in Israel. This could not have happened without the hand of God. But don't take my word for it. This is supported by the scriptures as well, based on simple biblical logic. You see, according to the scriptures, when God blesses, no one can curse. And when he curses, no one can bless. When he opens a door, no one can close it. And when he closes a door, no one can open it. When he smites, no one can heal. And when he heals, no one can smite. In the same way, when he gathers, no one can scatter. And when he scatters, no one can gather. Since the Bible tells us that God scattered the Jewish people in his anger, there's only one possible way they can be back in the land today. God himself regathered them. To suggest that the Jewish people themselves, the United Nations, reestablished Israel is to say that God's will was overthrown by human effort. Perish the thought. This also explains why there's such extreme hostility towards the state of Israel, why so many radical groups want to wipe out the Jewish state, why the nations of the world want to determine Israel's boundaries, why these same nations refuse to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It's the same pattern that has existed for millennia. The nations of the world are hostile to the purposes of God, in particular, his purposes for Israel. This doesn't mean that everything Israel does is right, or everything the Palestinians do is wrong. And it doesn't mean that lovers of the God of the Bible should not pursue justice for all the Middle Eastern peoples. But it does mean the state of Israel exists today because God decreed it. And that means that God is a Zionist.
Our general point that Jews are not Zionists and Zionists are not Jews. The Zionist state does not represent Torah through Jews. It is against, its existence is against the Torah, against Jewish law. Our second point today here is more in details that they do digging up the graves of our sages because of their atheistic beliefs, their desecration of the holy grave sites, their desecration of everything that's holy and dear to us, their behavior and hostility of their police and their government against Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jewish people.
Rabašlag, gitarist alo skorom
Našla da iskustvo izvedimo neku matematičnu silimu da pa je dobro. Poslije ljudi jetzt sich mit Verschlassnissen Rat steht in der Aufgabe in Tannenscheid wegen den Weinen Hemden, was ist noch so. Also die ganze Zeit die Jota nach Peru shoppen soll ja wenn so sind wir wegen der Autorebbe. Also die friedige Zeit wird gesagt, später im Schiyo kennenlernen. Die wirklich wenig Zeit macht eine Kultur zu kennenlernen, lernen soll ja auch ein bisschen verbunden. Du stellst mir ich habe das mit der Art gebunden. Bei uns steht in den Chizis Chabad in Israel, also Chizis Chabad hat mal reingestellt in Janik und Kabole und mit der Bier, auf der es von Kochen bedienen da ist. שלילה מדברים תשידס חב"ד, אבל לפני זה עניין לקבולה שבצריך המלכת. מילה זה קולט דמות, זה שיימה הקל קלת. זה דמות זה משאלה, מגנית יצא מתשידס חב"ד, שהדבר תראה בזאת המזייצא מתשידס חב"ד. זאת דרך שרוב מלילה צול נער ונער ופשטה. Aber als Amerika von dem alten Leben kann ich nicht sagen, man kann nicht mehr alten Leben. ידעת לך, סוף סימן חופי נתניה bringt es מבאר דרך אכסידיס על פי דרך אריזל. משאת בפרש עצמה, schreibt nicht die Pirisch auf Kochnis HaKabula, nur על פי דרך אכסידיס על פי דרך אריזל. Also ich bringt in der Alte in dem סוף סימן חופי.
Aber Bescheid der Alte Rebbe bringt in derselbe Geres HaKedish. Und darf lernen Kabbalah und in Messiah. Und da riesiger im Sefer Atani und der Chsidis waren immer hunderter Maimorim. Das ist auch eine sichere Sache, dass es schon kein Stira wie Chalim in derselbe Geres. Und aber dann für Naru Tasche, das haben wir nicht schäbelt. Die, was wir schreiben, andere Sachen, aber bei uns die Kabbalah. Aber schauen wir lernen Chsidis Chabad, lernen Kabbalah und Nidle und Chsidis Chabad, auch über Jahre. Kommen das verreicht und das war wie smaklich sein soll sein bei Slocher, aber nach fast dann Schulstehen. Slocher. Das Status von den Brücken von Bischorn, ich dachte, wir haben ja. Das Schulstehen. Slocher.
Okay, mal eine von den Scholen. Das ist sehr gut.
Ich sage, das ist nur der Pchaim Italien.
Das ist Sefer Akadomus, was die See dort geschrieben. Akadomus, paar Meheten zu lernen, dem Limit das Weg.
Ist das nicht der Sefer Akadomus, der Pchaim Italien?
Nein.
Ich weiß nicht, was wollte reden zu helfen hier. Das ist ein Psyristel, das war allein. Das helft geweest in den Brücken. Das ist ein Psyristel. Das ist ein Besuch, was helft geweest an ihm.
Center of Kabbalah is a book called the Zohar, which is a book that collects knowledge from even older Jewish mystical works. It looks at verses in the Bible and ideas in Judaism through the lens of the 10 Sfirot. Put simply, each of these Sfirot is a way to interact with an aspect of God. Through these Sfirot, the Zohar created new ways to think about lots of the Bible and really to think about Judaism in general, mystical ways. Now, the Zohar was written in the 13th century in a culture where there was both intellectual curiosity and deep religious fervor. In this culture, this was in northern Spain, on one hand, they were influenced by the teachings of Maimonides, who was a Jewish thinker with a Greek philosophical perspective. So he said, you can't ever know what God does, just what God doesn't do. In other words, you shouldn't ever assume God's actions have a direct effect on you. It's an intellectual way to approach God. And then they were influenced by Christian Europe's religious fervor. God has a direct effect on me. So how can God simultaneously have an effect and not have an effect? Mysticism's answer is there are multiple aspects to God. We can't interact with God, who is unknowable, let's say the Ein Sof, but we can interact with 10 constricted aspects of God, the Sfirot. A small group of people wrote about this in 13th century northern Spain. One was Nachmanides in his interpretations of the Torah, and the other was Moshe de Leon, who collected older texts that formed into the Zohar. These older texts focused on trying to understand some difficult sections in the Bible, like the logic behind creation, or the chariot vision of Ezekiel, the apocalyptic visions of Daniel. Notably, only a small group of scholars read any of the Kabbalistic texts, including the Zohar, as it was generally accepted that studying them might drive you mad. That is, until 250 years later. So, 60 years after the Spanish Inquisition, Isaac Luria and Spot entered the picture. To greatly generalize, at this time, Jews were in a down place. The whole focus of the religion was on living in the past and being sad about where we are now, not in Spain having fun. Luria had this revelatory idea to take the principles of Kabbalism found in the Zohar and evolve them. Instead of it mostly being about understanding the Sfirot, Kabbalism was now about collecting sparks. Luria said the world was originally a perfect vessel, but it was destroyed and it's up to us to collect all of the pieces. Each time we do a good deed, we're collecting these sparks and taking another step towards the Messiah.